Today on Songmaker Part 2, we're taking the demo we built in Part 1 and laying down the actual tracks for real. It's a rock song built to an almost completely looped drum groove. How does that change things? We'll get into it. In maybe a little over 10 minutes for you, several days for me, we'll have an actual awesome sounding rock single. So start your engines and let's boogie. Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of the first Songmaker series, where we look at cool musical concepts and how they influence my process of writing, recording, producing and mixing my own music. Today we're continuing work on the song This Is an Illusion. It has a big, dumb, angular riff and a pretty poppy chorus. It goes to several different vibes in its harmony and melody, which it probably has to, considering the drum groove, the entire rhythmic vibe of the song, is looped throughout almost the entire track. In part 1, we listened to the very first demos, as rough and off-key as they were. We talked about the lyrics and built the first full band demo, so we could figure out how the groove-based arrangement was gonna work. Today, we're recording the actual final parts for the song. I'll be playing all of this myself, as that's kind of part of the challenge. I'm starting with the fundamental instruments, drums, bass, and rhythm guitars, and then overdubbing all the vocals, lead guitars, keys, and everything else. Then we'll dive into more production stuff, adding layers on layers of percussion, samples, and sound effects, taking the recordings from more of a registration to an actual production. And we'll end by mixing it all together, making sure the track feels right and hits hard. Okay, so maybe we need to talk about what the general stylistic choice, the genre blend, the aesthetic vibe is for this track and probably a lot of tracks after this one. It's maybe the most important question to answer before you even record a single note. And it's a central one I try to ask when doing pre-production with an artist before we start on a new record. I live and breathe rock music, specifically 90s rock and beyond. Grunge, industrial, stadium rock. But I don't want to make a pure rock record. That's been done to absolute death. Nowadays I'm listening to way more poppy stuff than even loud rock artists, which is a whole can of worms in and of itself. Trust me, we'll get to it. I'm always trying to balance heavy rockiness with the focus on melody, accessibility and hookiness that modern pop music has, which is in and of itself a way more electronic genre, so I'm always trying to blend synths and samples and effects in between the roaring guitars as well. Basically, I want to make records that rock, they are rocking, but they aren't rock as a genre. That's been done 3,000 times already, and I don't want to do that. I'm very much a sort of anti-traditionalist in general, and while I don't think I'm reinventing the wheel here just to cover my ass, the final version of this track does feel pretty fresh to me, so, let's get on our way there. So, since the looped groove is such a prominent part of the track, we need to find a sound for it that's fresh and original, since naturally it's always in danger of getting boring very quickly. I think we need to blend traditionally rock, more natural sounding elements like live drums, with more synthetic elements like drum machines and effect samples. A way to get those two worlds closer together is to approach one in the way you'd approach the other. In this case, that means separating the intended live drum part into 3 elements. The main ever-important looped drum groove, a second set of tracks with only the drum fills between sections, and a third take of only the crash and ride cymbals. This way you get way more control over how you use the tracks without, say, 40 dB of ride cymbal in your floor tom mic. It also allows me to emphasize how steady and repetitive the main looped part is, by mixing the overdubbed drum fills completely differently. And also not stopping the main beat, so sometimes it sounds like I have 4 hands, which subconsciously comes across as unnatural, even if you don't play drums, or so I've heard. If recording drums, drum fills and cymbals separately sounds kind of confusing, well, that's because it is. As a drummer, you're providing the foundation of the song, so to then yourself have to imagine several elements that you're used to playing can be quite disorienting, especially if you've never recorded like this before, or if, like me, you're building the drum sound, listening if all the mics work together, and finalizing your drum part in your head while you're literally playing the drum take. I take no pride in saying that the first few takes were rough. Stiff playing, not grooving, and missing several transitions. I got there in the end though. Speaking of building a drum sound, for all you nerds, I mean engineers, here's the mic list for the drums. I knew I wanted to blend the drums with hip-hoppy samples like 808, claps, snaps, and hi-hats. To make the drums as bright and punchy and almost unnaturally upfront as possible. A big part of getting the live drums to meet that and blend with that was this kick/snare mic. A thing I stole from Eric Valentine. Not the mic itself, the idea. Which you place underneath the snare, facing at the batter head of the kick drum. Capturing the high frequencies of your kick and your snare through the same mic means they get a very homogeneous top end. They attack in the same way, which is also kind of unnatural and sample-like. I also ran a mic through a guitar amp in the room with an 8th note delay pedal on it, to give the loop a rhythmic echo that blends into all of the same mics, making it feel more like an actual part of the loop than if I would have put it on later in Pro Tools. So, after that whole rigmarole of getting all those different elements that make up the drum part together, you can imagine the relief to get to play bass. This track is pretty straightforward. I picked up the precision bass I have on loan from one of my best friends, plugged it directly into Pro Tools, used an amp simulation and even a specific DI simulation, did a couple of takes and that was it. Now, seeing as rock and more electronic music have very different interpretations of the bass role in the track, I'm splitting that role between this bass guitar track, a synth bass I recorded on a Mini Moog, more on that later, and a pure sine wave playing in the lowest octave to have a very steady source of sub-information. This meant that the role of the bass guitar shifted from the main source of grounding for the track to more like a low guitarist thing, so the synths could rule in the ultra-low frequencies. Recording the rhythm guitars was pretty fun. The part hadn't changed since the demo, so playing one left, one right was easy. The main challenge was making a guitar sound that wasn't aggressive and piercing in the mid-range in the way most rock guitars are. And in the spirit of blending two worlds together, I ended up using my Ibanez Les Paul through both my mic'd up Fender amp and the Guitar Rig software, where I was using a lo-fi, digitally distorted, noisy setup, almost like a demonic Game Boy. Blending the two together got me to a Queens of the Stone Age-like warm, fuzzy sound with a weird 8-bit sputtering quality to it, which is especially apparent on the final chord as the digital degeneration craps out. Now, it's not exactly a new idea to use synths in rock music. The Beatles did it, followed by a million other bands. It was, however, pretty unusual in the grunge era, which is the style I'm leaning on most in this song. Purists would hate it, so I kinda love it. It's also really fun to play with types of synths you don't normally hear on tracks like these, such as a really messed up version of one of those high West Coast hip-hop synth lead lines, which is absolutely in there, go listen for it, or a big, massive, epic, big room synth badge ripped straight out of EDM. If it feels like it doesn't belong, you must be making something new, is usually what I'm thinking. Remember how I also used a Moog synthesizer to function as a bass? Well, in the end I completely distorted that thing until it sat more like a weird low single note guitar-ish thing. I blended that with the main rhythm guitars to make them feel a lot more synthetic. I wasn't done in the guitar department yet though. I wanted to add some layers with different sounds at key moments. Most prominently, the main verse guitar, played through the ugliest amp in the world. A teeny tiny practice amp I got with my first guitar when I was like 6. It's super scratchy and boxy and just sounds small, but that's what's so cool about it. It makes it sit in a way higher frequency range than most normal guitar amps. On the big descending hits into the chorus and the Soundgarden-esque third chorus line, I added 2 low single note guitars with a sub-octaver to make them extra weighty and huge. Finally, if you watch part 1 all the way to the end, you might have heard there's a little guitar solo after the second chorus. I ended up completely changing that part, making it less of a conventional guitar solo and more like an extra melodic element. It's not as improvised now. I did find a great trick here though. I added the Sound Toys Alter Boy, which gave it a glitchy, robotic, droney quality, which I then automated to jump octaves up and down, giving it some random modulation, which I think is super cool. So then, vocals. This was a real challenge. I hadn't sung lead vocals in a very long time, and especially the chorus melody is very tricky. It jumps up an octave and then very quickly goes almost all the way back down again. I really needed to find the right tone of voice for the chorus as well. I must have done at least 20 takes before I settled on the right use of falsetto. There's also quite a lot of vocal layering going on, which is a very poppy way of arranging. My references for how huge I wanted those vocals to get were Harry Styles' Golden and Ariana Grande's Dangerous Woman. Did I just reference Harry Styles and Ariana Grande in a video about making grunge rock? I wonder how many people I've offended with that one. Anyway, the verses are pretty straightforward. It's just a double-track lead vocal down the middle. But the chorus lead is literally made up of 7 different vocals playing at the same time. 5 lead vocals panned out from left to right, and 2 low octaves panned out halfway to the sides. And I do actually need all of them. I tried it with 3 leads and it just didn't work as well. It was still too thin. There's even a loud vocal that comes in later where I sing the falsetto part of the chorus in high chest voice for more energy. It's a Chris Cornell type thing, and it's also literally in Harry Styles' Golden. See, they're not that different. It stands to reason that for those 8 vocal takes to sound more or less as one massive lead, you'd need to edit them extremely tightly. Getting the timing to sit right was a lot of work. Obviously, on such a steady loop beat with this kind of consciously non-traditional or synthetic vibe I'm going for, you're gonna want the timing of all the other parts to not be too loose so that they don't ruin the forward momentum. For example, I made the choice to edit the verse guitar to very obviously stutter. I originally played this pattern, but it felt more robotic to just take one of those drums per chord and copy-paste them. Approaching the traditionally rocky elements as if they were synthetic lines up more with the loop beat and with all the electronic drum samples over the top of that. Because I think it's high time we finalize that drum loop, right? Let's reinforce the acoustic drums with a bunch of samples to both emphasize important hits in the beat and really cross over the rocky drums with the more electronic and pop-oriented part of the production. Now, in some circles this is regarded as not done, but I use triggers on the kick and snare to add samples to them, making them more unnaturally even. I also added a couple of extra bass drums for more boom in key moments, like lengthening the boom towards the next snare, and on the downbeats, the one of the choruses. There's also some hip-hop 808 claps on the snare, some electronic snaps between literally every beat, a very Linkin Park-esque electronic hi-hat ticking along in the choruses, and some reverse cymbals and claps as lead-ins to big hits. It's actually quite a lot, for me at least. If you mute the live drums in the choruses, it pretty much sounds like it's a very busy hip-hop track. Check this out. Finally, there's sound effects. I was never really into stuff like this, but in certain cases it really does make the difference between a registration and a production. There's not a massive amount here. Most obviously there's some siren-like sounds leading into some sections, which I believe I made from messing up the Moog bass even further. There's a weird anti-phase drone thing and a really corny EDM trick of having pure white noise through a filter and then opening the filter up towards big moments and then back down again. It's like this nebulous pure energy because there's absolutely no musical information in there. It's just pure noise. So, all the tracks are there, the sounds are in place. Let's mix this bad boy over the finish line, shall we? Mixing this track was pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you both play everything and produce the whole thing, you end up with a pretty clear idea of how everything should fit together. So I cleaned up the session a bit and then I decided to mix it all through the Console 1 SSL emulation. As almost all of the records of the artists I've mentioned so far were mixed on SSLs, and they're super tight and punchy and forward and present, something I wanted to emphasize, as you know. Mixing the drums was an odd balance of mixing rock sounds like they're hip-hop and mixing electronic sounds like they're rock. So I distorted almost all the synthetic samples to hell while making the live drums unnaturally punchy. Getting the chorus pop vocal sound right was pretty tricky. As for the vocal to be that close all the time without getting annoying, every little change in resonance in my voice needed to be more or less locked in place. Oak Sound Soothe 2, one of my favorite plugins in the world, Softube Tape and the Waves C6 did most of the heavy lifting there. There's also Slate Fresh Air at the very end of the vocal path to give it that compressed poppy air that came out of an old Dolby encoder trick, I think. I don't know, don't look at me, I just press buttons. Alrighty, so that's the whole story. We went from the crappiest sounding initial mumbly voice memo to a full-blown stadium, grunge, industrial, pop rock, whatever track. And if I may say so myself, I think both the song and the production worked pretty well. I'm very proud of it. It releases on streaming this Friday, June 11th. Check it out. Here's an extra little snippet for you. Let me know what you think in the comments below or tag me on Instagram @musicbypeacekeeper. I'll see you soon. Bye.
If you were the one, that's not what you mean.